All right, so for our last lesson of the semester, I've got the title here, Alternatives to Capitalism, question mark. So the stuff we've been talking about through most of this semester has generally been working within a capitalist framework because that is the system that dominates our world. Today, it's the system that we all live within here in the United States. So it's important to understand how capitalist systems work and the economic geography that they produce. But I think it's also useful to look outside of that system and ask what other types of economies could there be? Would other forms of economic organization be desirable or not? And could we change the system if we decided that we wanted to do that? So we're going to actually start this lesson by looking at some of the defenses of capitalism that are made. So we should understand what can be said in favor of capitalism before we start looking at then the critiques of capitalism, some of the negative claims that are made about this system. And then we'll look into some of the specific alternatives that people have proposed. So if there's something wrong with capitalism, what could we do instead? And then we'll wrap up by talking about how change might occur within an economic system. If we wanted to get away from a capitalist system, how could we do that? But I really want to start here by asking, can there be an alternative at all? So Francis Fukuyama famously came up with this expression, the end of history. So he popularized this in an article in 1989 and then wrote a book a few years later where he claimed that we had reached the end of major social transformations in our world, that the social systems that became dominant in the world as of the end of the Cold War, so that's the capitalist economic system and representative democracy of the sort that we see in places like the United States, that was kind of the final evolution of human societies, and that we weren't ever going to go beyond that to any other sort of system. And so the quote here from him, he says that the end of the Cold War was, quote, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, that is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So he basically said that we've got the most advanced possible form of society that we're ever going to get, and so that's kind of where we're going to stay. And he was basing this on an evolutionary view of economic history. So we've mentioned evolutionary theories a little bit in past lessons, the idea that there is this kind of fixed set of stages that societies go through. And so according to him, we had reached the final stage. And he is in this drawing on the philosopher Hegel, who was also the teacher of Karl Marx, who also had this evolutionary view of history. It's just that Marx thought there was one more stage beyond capitalism. So Marx said, well, we'll go through capitalism, and there's one more step, we'll get to communism, and that will be the end of history. That will be the final stage. So both Fukuyama and Marx both have this idea of these evolutionary stages that society is going to go through, and we're going to reach a final one where things are going to stop. As a contrasting view, the quote that I've got here, and let me move my face out of the way of it here, this is a very popular quote among people that disagree with Fukuyama and that think there can be and generally hope there will be something beyond the contemporary capitalist system that society will transform into. And this actually comes from a science fiction writer, Ursula K. Le Guin, where she said, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. So that's a different perspective that says that we can have another type of society, that just because a non-capitalist way of organizing society seems unthinkable, it's hard to imagine how that could work, that doesn't mean it's impossible, because people tend to have their imagination kind of stuck within the kind of society that they currently live in. It's hard to imagine things being so dramatically different, but we know that our society is dramatically different, unthinkably different from societies that existed in the past. And I've got a note down there about one of her novels that I think is a pretty interesting one to read if you haven't come across it or read it yet that looks at these questions of alternative economic systems. And it's called The Dispossessed and Ambiguous Utopia. And the book is about a planet where there's kind of a capitalist type of system, and this group of people that want to establish a different kind of economic system go to this planet's moon and set up their own society there. And the book kind of flashes back and forth between these two different societies. And it's called An Ambiguous Utopia because she's very forthright about the problems of this alternative non-capitalist society and where its flaws and shortcomings lie, even as she's also not stinting about the problems of the more capitalist type of society on the original planet that the people in this world came from. So, interesting novel to take a look at if you're into science fiction. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that can be said in defense of capitalism. What would capitalism's supporters and defenders say makes this system work well and makes it superior to other sorts of systems that we might have? So one big thing that's often said in defense of capitalism is that it's a way of harnessing our selfish human nature. So people are kind of inherently selfish. We tend to do what's good for us, even at the cost of hurting other people. We're not inherently collaborative. You know, we're not like bees or ants that do everything for the good of the collective hive. Right? Bees will happily sacrifice themselves for the good of the hive. People aren't like that. We're selfish. We're individualistic. We want to be able to do our own thing. And the great thing about capitalism in this view is that it manages to produce all these benefits from everybody by harnessing that selfishness. And so a famous quote that kind of captures that comes from Adam Smith, one of the founders of the neoclassical classical school of economics. And he said, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." So in a capitalist system, we don't have to hope that the baker feels charitable towards us and wants to help us out by giving us bread. We instead say, "Hey, baker, wouldn't you be so much better off if I gave you this money for that bread?" And selfishly, the baker will trade us bread for money, and then we can eat. So that idea lies behind a lot of defenses of capitalism, and it was kind of taken to an extreme by the philosopher Ayn Rand, who argued that the selfishness of human nature is not just this unfortunate thing that we have to work with, and wouldn't it be nice if we were all more altruistic, but sadly it's not the case. She said, no, in fact, selfishness is good. We should all be as selfish as possible, and that's why capitalism is great, is because it allows everybody to pursue their own selfish ends in a system that's going to work out for everybody. Kind of related to this is the idea that capitalism generates competition among buyers and sellers. Right? So if everybody's trying to get the best deal for themselves, right? If everybody's being selfish within that market, you're going to get a competition. Everybody's trying to outdo each other, right? Offer a better product for a lower price in order to get more customers and get more money. And this competition among buyers and sellers is going to spur efficiency and innovation. Right? You're always looking for a better way to make your product because that is going to get you more money, and it's going to allow you to take customers away from your competitors. And then somebody else is always coming along thinking, oh, I could get in on that market if I could, make this product even better. And so that's good for everybody because that's an incentive to make better stuff more efficiently at a better price and so forth. Another thing that you'll hear in defense of capitalism is that it's based on freedom of exchange. So if you think back to our first lesson, we talked about the market being about people having transactions where both of them are aiming for their own advantage, right? You don't agree to make the trade unless you think that you are getting something out of it. And so if you have kind of a moral or ethical belief that preserving this freedom of exchange is paramount, then capitalism would seem to be a system that suits that, right? That it's wrong to stop people from making free transactions. If both people in a transaction agree to it, nobody else should be able to step in and stop it or say that there's, some other factor that is outweighing that. And so a a famous formulation of this is what's called the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. That was put forward by the philosopher Robert Nozick. And so at the time that Nozick was writing, Wilt Chamberlain was the most famous and highest paid basketball player in the NBA. And so then, as now, you've probably heard people complain that, oh, those professional athletes get paid millions of dollars just to play a game. Isn't that unfair? And so Nozick said, well, what's happening there is that there are lots and lots of people who are willing to pay Wilt Chamberlain some money to get to see him play basketball. And so if all those people are of their own free will giving Wilt Chamberlain their money so that they get to see him play basketball, who should say that that's wrong? Who's going to come along and say, no, you're not allowed to pay Wilt Chamberlain to watch him play basketball if that's what you freely want to do? And if the result of that is that Wilt Chamberlain ends up way richer than anybody else, well, that's just how it works out. All those people wanted to give him all of that money. And then the last defense of capitalism that I want to talk about is the idea that prices in the market act as information aggregators. And so this is a idea that was put forward by the Austrian economist F.A. Hayek. And the basic idea here is that prices are not measurements of some sort of real value that things have. And this is a thing that people often kind of think, is that a price is some sort of an indication of the true value of a thing. And if the price doesn't match what we think the true value of a thing is, then something is priced wrong. And if the price is higher than the true value, that you're getting ripped off by it, right? So if I can buy this bottle of soda at the store for $1.29, that means the soda is worth $1.29. The $1.29 tells you the value of that soda. And if at another store they're selling that same bottle of soda for $3, then that price, that is an excessive price. It's wrong for that price to be so high. I'm getting ripped off if I pay $3 for that soda that's only really worth $1.29. We often think of that way, that prices reflect some sort of real value of the thing. But Hayek argued that prices are actually just signals about the demand for things. They're not reflective of any sort of real value there. And so prices are going to go up and down based on all of the different potential buyers and what their knowledge about their circumstances is. So every individual person has a whole bunch of knowledge about their situation, what kinds of things they need, what kind of things they can do without, right? I know for my personal circumstances, when I'm thinking about buying that bottle of soda, I know how much I really want and need that soda, right? How thirsty am I? How satisfying would water or Gatorade or whatever else be instead of that soda if I couldn't get it? I have all this information about my personal circumstances and needs, as does every other customer looking to buy that soda. And so what the price does is it essentially pulls that information together and lets the soda company know how badly that soda is wanted. And so if lots of us are wanting that soda, then the price will get bid up. And the rising price will tell the soda company, oh, there's lots of desire for that soda. And so it's a better use of our resources to take more of our bottling machines and have them make that type of soda, right? So like, say it's grape soda that, the price is getting bid up on because lots of people have decided they want it. And it's going to be good for us as the soda company to put more of our bottling machines into producing that grape soda where the price is going up, and maybe take out of production the root beer where the price has gone down because not as many people want it. And so the prices have sent this information to the soda company so that they can figure out how much they need to create. Something that would be very hard for them to do based purely on like market research or something to figure out exactly how many people would want a thing. But the price tells them right away. If they're running out of things and the price is going up, then they should make more of it. And then if there is some other thing that they could be making instead that would have a higher price, that tells them that that's a more valuable use of those resources. So these price signals direct goods and services towards the people who can make the best use of them, and it it coordinates this economic activity. So we don't get surpluses of things that nobody wants and shortages of things that are in high demand. And the implication then of this argument is that the best way to solve a problem in society is to put a price on it, because that price will then aggregate all of this information. So this lies behind things like the idea of putting a price on carbon, which you may have heard of this as a thing that's been proposed to deal with climate change. So if we have a way that instead of CO2 just being released into the atmosphere as an externality, if we can make it so that there is a price to that, then that will send a signal to businesses that that carbon is an undesirable thing because it's a cost to them, and they will find the most efficient way to reduce that CO2 output. So if you bring the market in and you start pricing things that had no price attached to them, then the market will find the most efficient way to direct resources towards addressing people's needs. So these are some of the things that you'll find people arguing in order to defend the capitalist system. It's like capitalism as a system, maybe specific ways that it's working out and specific regulations that exist and all those things might not be quite right, but capitalism sort of as a system is a good system or is a functional system. So now we can move into some of the critiques of capitalism, right? What would people say defending the idea that capitalism is not such a good system and that we should be looking for alternative systems? So if we go back to that first idea that capitalism harnesses this inherent selfish human nature, a lot of critics will say that this idea that humans are just inherently selfish is not something that exists like transhistorically even before capitalism came along, but that the kind of selfishness that you see operating within capitalism is actually a product of capitalism, that we learn to be the kind of selfish economic actors that capitalism needs by growing up and living within a capitalist system. And so within a different sort of economic system, people would learn to be different. Human nature would be different. So, maybe not quite such nature as people assume. So if we had a different economic system that wasn't based on expecting everybody to try to always get the best deal for themselves individually, then people's sort of attitude and approach towards the world would not be so selfish, and so it wouldn't seem like we needed a system that was all based around harnessing selfishness. And then if we look at the defense of capitalism in terms of people's freedom of exchange, right? Like the Wilt Chamberlain argument, if people want to freely give their money to someone else and that person gets rich, then, that was their free choice and we shouldn't interfere with that. Critics will say in response to that the freedom that we would seem to have within a capitalist system is kind of an illusion, that people are coerced into things by their circumstances, that you don't have the full range of possible choices. You have a specific menu of just a few choices in front of you. And even if you are picking freely within that menu of choices, the fact that you don't have all these other opportunities means that your freedom is very limited. So if your choice is to work in this terrible low-paying job where you're going to get cancer or starve to death, you may freely choose to work in that terrible job, but that's not really freedom. You can't say, oh, well, you chose it, so I can't complain about it, because you're kind of coerced by the circumstances. All your other options were so much worse. And so critics will say that within a capitalist system, a lot of people get backed into these corners where the choices available to them that they have the freedom to choose among don't include any good options, whereas other people get a whole range of great options in front of them. And so kind of jumping off from that, then capitalism clearly enables massive social inequalities to exist. So far more than any other economic system that has ever existed, we see huge gaps between the rich and the poor in the amount of resources they have available, in the kinds of quality of life that they're able to get. And we clearly see that whenever societies that were non-capitalist transition to a capitalist society. So if you look at a place like Russia that transitioned after the fall of the Soviet Union into a capitalist type of society, you saw inequality grow substantially. We're seeing inequalities growing quite a lot in China as China moves into a more capitalist kind of economy today. We saw it in places like Middle and South America when they transitioned from import substitution to a neoliberal type of economy that was moving deeper into a capitalist kind of system, and inequality went way up in those societies. So if you're coming from an egalitarian type of a ethical point of view, and that you think that inequality is inherently wrong, then this is a big problem with capitalism, that it seems to encourage these huge inequalities to exist. And the situation that the people on the lower end of these inequalities are in can often be pretty dire. And so even if you're not worried about inequality for its own sake, you may be concerned that some people are in pretty bad shape while the resources to help them exist, but they're held by the people that have a ton of stuff and have no direct incentive to use those resources to help out the people that are worse off. So the inequality that can exist under capitalism is the source of a lot of critique, and it's often the starting point for people who end up with a critical view of capitalism. And then another thing that we see, kind of the dark side of the idea of competition pushing towards innovation and efficiency in capitalism, is that it creates this relentless push for optimization that kind of takes over all parts of life. And so I've got some examples of where in our world today we see this push to optimize and make everything totally efficient and totally focused on maximizing productivity seems to have kind of corrosive effects on society. So the first one is with universities. So we sometimes talk about universities as being the ivory tower separate from quote unquote real life. But in fact, universities today are subject to huge capitalist pressures. Even public universities like Slippery Rock are subject to these capitalist pressures for productivity and efficiency. And so I sometimes tell people that when I do the open house things for prospective students, and they come to talk to me about possibly majoring in geography or geology in our department, the three main questions that kids and their parents will ask me are, first, what kind of jobs can I get with this major? Second, what kind of jobs can I get with this major? And third, what kind of jobs can I get with this major? So all other considerations about college, about what the experience will be like, about how it will improve you as a person, all these other kinds of things go out the window. It's all about, is this the most efficient way for me to maximize my future earnings? That's the only thing that they care about. And the administration of the university recognizes that. And there's increasing pressure on departments to demonstrate that you are preparing your students for high-paying jobs. And if not, then your programs are seen as serving no real purpose within the university. So that's one area where we see this pressure for optimization. Another one is the idea of everyone having to always be self-marketing. And so this is something that you may have heard advice on in terms of your social media use, that you should always be thinking in terms of what you post to Instagram or Twitter or whatever other sites you're on, about how is that marketing yourself. And you sometimes hear the term brand me. So people think of themselves not as a person who is getting entertainment from and social connections and stuff from being on social media, but as a brand that needs to be marketed. So every interaction you have with other people on social media should be about positioning yourself within the market as someone who is valuable as a potential employee or something like that. And it's the kind of thing that is kind of sad to see, because your whole life becomes about marketing yourself and never about like just having fun with your Instagram account, unless you're having fun in exactly the way that will make you look good and build, useful connections with people that you can use to get a job or whatever. Um, but at the same time, you kind of have to do it because if you don't, everybody else is marketing themselves through their social media, and you're going to get left in the dust. You're not going to get the job. So there's this pressure to turn yourself into a commodity essentially. And then the last example is the idea of self-care becoming a duty. So when people first started talking about the concept of self-care, the idea was that sometimes you need to step away from all of this pressure to optimize yourself as a productive worker and take some time for yourself, right? Something separate from what you do for your job. But the people that run the jobs realize that, well, if you do some self-care, you'll actually be a more productive worker. And so self-care has gone from something you do to get away from your job to something that you do in order to be better at your job. So you now have to try to find a way to make your self-care time maximally efficient in order to return you to your work in a way that's going to be the most productive. So this pressure for optimization taking over all facets of everyone's life is something that also seems to be a negative effect of capitalism as we know it today. Another set of critiques of capitalism come under the umbrella of the idea of contradictions within the capitalist system. So a contradiction occurs when you have two social forces that spring from the same source. So they're interlinked. You can't have one without the other, but they undermine each other. So they clash with each other, and therefore they produce crises in the system. The system will go through a crisis or a collapse of some sort, out of which the system then either has to reinforce itself, or that can create an opportunity to change the system while it's in the midst of this kind of crisis situation. So what's called the first contradiction of capitalism is something that was first outlined by Karl Marx and is one of the kind of centerpieces of his critique of capitalism. And it starts from the idea that the wages that workers are getting for work are also the money that they're then going to go and spend on the products that their company and other companies are making. So the owners of capital want to increase their profits by cutting wages to their workers. As the business owner, you want to pay your workers as little as possible because that reduces your costs and increases your profits. But if all the businesses are paying their workers very little, then who is going to buy their products? Right? The workers that you have in your company are the customers for your and everybody else's company. So it can be nice if you cut your wages and nobody else does, because your own workers are a small percentage of your customers. But if everybody's doing that, then nobody has any money to buy anything from any of these companies. So it's this kind of self-undermining phenomenon. And so this was sort of temporarily resolved by a system called Fordism in the middle of the 20th century. And it's called that because it's kind of inspired by Henry Ford, the founder of the car company, who famously said that he wanted all of his workers to earn enough money at the Ford factory to be able to purchase a Ford automobile for themselves. And so in the middle of the 20th century, we had this kind of temporary stabilization of the system in which the government and strong unions sort of forced all companies to pay their workers pretty well. So nobody could kind of get away with being the one company that slashes the wages and kind of upsets the system. And then because all the workers are getting paid well, they were able to buy all the stuff that all these companies were producing. But that system has kind of fallen apart over the last half century. So that's the so-called first contradiction of capitalism. And then there's the second contradiction of capitalism, which is a theory outlined by James O'Connor, who is also the one that called the other one the first, since he came up with a second. And so let me move my face out of the way of that so you can see it. So this second contradiction of capitalism is the idea that capitalism constantly expands its use of nature, which undermines the natural base that it depends on. So capitalism is constantly trying to extract more resources from nature, but in doing that, undercuts itself by destroying its natural base. And so there's a lot of debate about whether preservation of natural resources and maintenance of ecology are something that is compatible with a capitalist system. And O'Connor's argument is that it's not. That capitalism will inevitably undermine itself by destroying its own natural resource base. Okay, so if we accept some of those critiques of capitalism, we think, well, maybe capitalism isn't the best possible system, what might be some of the other options that we might look at? So the best known alternative system to capitalism is what we'd call a planned or command economy. And so this is the type of economy that was implemented by communist countries like the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cuba. And I put the term communist in quotation marks there because there's a lot of really unproductive debate over whether the system that existed in these countries was real communism or not. Because lots of people will say, well, it is true communism, and that's why communism can never work. And other people say, well, no, its flaws show that it clearly couldn't have been true communism. And other people say, well, because it was true communism, it actually worked, and all of the critiques of it are just bourgeois propaganda and all this kind of stuff. And trying to define exactly what true communism is and whether these countries lived up to it, I think tends to be an unproductive debate. So I think it's actually more useful to describe this as a planned or command economy, because that kind of gets at the basis for how the economies in these countries tended to work, and we don't have to worry about whether this is sort of true communism or not. Another thing to keep in mind is that in a lot of the discussion about this type of economy and whether it works and how it stacks up to capitalism, that a lot of people on both sides, right, both the supporters and the detractors of this type of economic organization, tend to assume that it's either this or capitalism. Those are your only two options. And they do this because it makes it easier to argue, because it's a lot easier to point out the flaws in capitalism than to defend the way that the planned economy worked in practice, and vice versa. It's a lot easier to point out the flaws in command economies than it is to give a clear defense of capitalism as it has actually existed. So this false dichotomy kind of makes the arguments easy, and you'll see a lot of people, when faced with a critique of their own preferred economic system, will reply by pointing out problems in the other of these two. But as we're going to see in this lesson, these are not the only two possible ways that you can do an economy. So if there are problems with capitalism and problems with a planned or command economy, well, maybe we need to find some third or fourth kind of option out there. So the basis for this kind of economic system is that you have central planners who make all the decisions about production and distribution. So rather than letting private companies make decisions about what they're going to produce, how much they're going to make, where they're going to distribute it to, and trusting the invisible hand of the market to work out so that enough stuff for everybody gets produced, you have a central planner who is, at least in theory, not necessarily always in practice, but certainly in theory, making this plan for what's going to be good for society as a whole. So for society as a whole, for everyone to be happy, how many cars do we need to be made this year? How many sets of boots do we need made this year? How many of everything else? So the central planner will come up with this plan of what needs to be produced and how it's going to be distributed, and then they'll give quotas out to the the plants, the factories, and so forth, that then have quotas for their workers and say, all right, well, the central plan says that we need to make X cars this year, so we're going to be judged whether we've managed to make that many cars or not. So some of the problems that have arisen in these sorts of economies are, first, you can often get underproduction of important goods because it's very difficult for a central planner to actually figure out how much you would need. And there are arguments in the economics literature that it's actually literally impossible for a central planner to perfectly plan out everything that might be needed in an economy. So you'll get certain important goods that will end up underproduced, and so there'll be shortages of important things, and especially shortages of the kind of things that aren't kind of sexy and cool to central planners. So a lot of kind of consumer entertainment goods and stuff were often underproduced in the Soviet Union and then smuggled in on the black market sometimes from Europe or the United States because the central planners in Moscow didn't put as high a value on those kind of things, even though lots of people wanted them. You also can have problems with quality because if your goal is simply to meet the quota that you've been given by the planners, you can meet that quota more easily if you make low quality goods because you can get them out the door a lot quicker. And if you've been assigned to make these goods, people that need those goods don't have anywhere else to go if they don't like the quality of it. You also have a lot of potential for coercion in a system like this. If it's the central planners giving these commands as to what needs to be made, then people that don't go along with the plan, people that want to go do their own thing, can face a lot of coercion to keep them in line with the plan. And you've got the problem of a one-way information flow, that the people at the top, the central planners, have their plan and that gets distributed out to everyone else. So this kind of downward flow of information, but there's not a good way for information from the bottom, the things that, the consumers and the workers that are actually on the assembly line, those kind of things. If they see issues or opportunities or anything like that, there's not a good way for that information to filter back up to the central planners for them to make use of it in revising that plan. So those are some of the problems that were encountered by countries that tried to institute this large-scale command economy. So then the first further alternative, right? We've got capitalism, we've got planned economies. The first possible alternative is just to go kind of in the middle, right? To make this a spectrum rather than two alternatives and create a mixed economy of some sort in the center of that scale. And of course, you can, that central point can be tilted towards one side or tilted towards the other, and they can mix the features of these different systems in different sorts of ways. So one way that you mix these features together would be a Keynesian system. So this is named after the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who had a really influential analysis of the Great Depression that struck in 1929, where his argument was that capitalism left on to its own devices is going to inevitably create these crashes that are very hard to get out of, and so you need active government management of the economy. The government needs to really be overseeing the overall functioning of the economy and intervening to keep these kinds of things from happening. And so one of the most famous Keynesian types of interventions, which we're hearing a lot of talk about now with the economic problems that have resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic, is the idea of a stimulus. So if the economy gets kind of stuck, that nobody has a job, so nobody has any money, so nobody can buy stuff, so companies don't have any income with which to hire people to jobs, that you can kind of get out of that trap by the government spending a whole bunch of money, putting money into people's pockets. So governments did that after the Great Depression with things like the Civilian Conservation Corps in the United States, where the federal government paid people who were unemployed a bunch of money to work on various projects to try to get money circulating in the economy again. You saw there was a big stimulus package that was passed in the United States after the 2008 recession hit, and now again there's talk of stimulus for COVID-19 and the problems it's created. That's a Keynesian kind of idea. You also have mixed economies that are on the social democratic model. And so the classic case for this would be the Nordic countries, so Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, those countries, where you have a basically capitalist base to the economy, but then a very active role of the government in taxing and redistributing that money. So addressing the inequalities that can arise from capitalism by taxing a whole bunch of money from the people that are getting rich and using it for generous social support programs for the people that would be poor. And if you remember the map that we showed of the Gini coefficient, the Nordic countries are among the more equal countries, and are among the countries with the lower Gini coefficients in the world today. So they have a basically capitalist system, but with a very redistributive government. You also often see in social democracies democratic organizations within companies. So they're trying to get away from that inherent clash between the interests of the owners of the company and the workers, right? The owners want to pay the workers as little as possible to cut costs. The workers, of course, want to get as high a salary as they can because people want money. And so if the owners and the workers are two separate groups, then they're going to clash over that, and there's going to be that kind of conflict. But if your company itself is organized internally on a more democratic basis, right, instead of owners in charge, workers do what they're told in order to get their paycheck. If you have a more democratic internal organization, then everybody in the company is sort of on the same page. They have the same incentives for all of the decisions that get made about how the company is run. And then the third kind of mixed economy concept that I want to talk about is the idea of state capitalism. So you see this in cases like Russia today or China today, which has moved away from the pure planned economy type of model that they had shortly after the Communist Party took over in 1949. They moved a lot towards the capitalist side of this spectrum. And in a state capitalist type of system, you have a undemocratic or authoritarian kind of government. So, the Chinese government is not a democracy. People don't get to vote for their leaders there. Russia has kind of the outward trappings of democracy, but it's clear that opposition parties stand no real chance in that system. So you have this undemocratic government that is steering the capitalist type of economic activity that occurs within the country. So we have some different possible ways that we can mix together features of a capitalist or a planned economy. But we can also go, in another dimension, orthogonal to that one-dimensional scale between those two options. And one common way to do this is what I'm referring to here as localist economic systems. So both capitalism and command economies tend to be big. They are, national scale, international scale. Their goal is to increase production, to make lots and lots of stuff, and to have this kind of really wide-ranging kind of control over the economy. And so these localist viewpoints say, well, maybe growth and being really big is not a good thing. Maybe there's inherent problems with this, and that a better, more functional economy that's going to be give people more genuine prosperity is to have a more locally focused economy where things are happening at a scale much closer to where people are. And maybe the problem is we've got these economic institutions that are just so gigantic that they overwhelm the human element to the economy. So this localist idea can be implemented in a number of different ways. So I'm just going to give a few examples. So one very modest way that you may encounter a localist approach to economies is with what's called a local exchange trading system or a local currency. So in certain places, people have created a local currency. So when you buy and sell things at participating businesses, instead of buying and selling with dollars, you can buy and sell with the local currency that exists. So if one of these were to exist in Pittsburgh, there doesn't, as far as I can tell, exist one here. But if there was one, they might be called like Pittsbucks, right? So you'd have this alternative currency that could be earned and spent at participating businesses within Pittsburgh. But you couldn't take your Pittsbucks and go buy something in Cleveland with them, because Cleveland would have their own local currency. Whereas if you have a dollar, You could go to Cleveland and spend that dollar just fine. Right? A dollar is worth a dollar everywhere in the United States because it's this national currency, and you can easily exchange that dollar for pounds if you go to Britain, or for yuan if you go to China or whatever. So it's kind of global currency system. But with this local currency, you're forced to keep your spending local. If somebody buys something from you with these Pitts bucks, you can only spend those on other local things. So it keeps that economic activity focused locally. If you were to kind of expand this idea for a locally based economy beyond just people using this local currency alongside the standard national currency, you could get to some of the ideas that are associated with anarchism. So the basic principle of anarchism is a rejection of coercive rule over people by others. So all these big economic systems involve some level of coercion, people being forced to accept systems and decisions that they didn't themselves freely consent to. And so an anarchist economic model is aimed at avoiding that kind of coercion. And to do that, it usually involves focusing on locally based systems for managing all of the scarcities that your economy has to deal with. So there's the underlying principles of this system. Rather than growth and accumulation of profits, it's self-sufficiency and mutual aid. The idea is that people should be as self-sufficient as possible. Local communities should be as self-sufficient as possible. You shouldn't depend on this global economy to be able to meet your basic needs. And all the decisions about production and distribution of the various goods and services that are produced in your economy are made through a sort of democratic consensus-based kind of system. So it's you and your neighbors deciding together how you are going to organize things, rather than individuals pursuing whatever is going to make them the most profit in the global marketplace. And then these local, largely self-sufficient economic spheres are linked together at a higher scale in decentralized networks. So you don't have central planners deciding how it's all going to be coordinated among different places. You don't have an international market, but rather you have networks of interaction among these local economic areas, and they're also making consensus-based decisions. So if you're engaging in trade with another local economic area, you're doing that on the basis of the consensus of everyone involved. And you may have representatives from a bunch of these places get together to talk about issues that are broader scale issues, but those representatives can't just make decisions and impose them on all of their communities that they represent. They have to take these ideas that they've hashed out and go back to those local communities and gain consensus there, and there may be some back and forth between these levels. So that's this anarchist kind of model for a locally based economic system that is not controlled by some sort of central authority like central planning and government, and that's not subject to this pursuit of profit in the capitalist system. And a related type of localist economic system would be bioregionalism. And so the key distinctive feature of bioregionalism is that you want to match the scale of social and economic activity to ecological regions. So, right now, a lot of our social and economic activity takes place on the basis of regions that are defined by people. Right? The United States, as a country, it has the borders that it has as the result of history and politics and so forth. It doesn't match up to any sort of natural or ecological boundaries, right? Our borders cut right through major ecosystems, and we've seen a lot of issues with that on the southern border, especially where the desert ecosystems have this kind of arbitrary political border put across them. So you get very different sorts of management on either side, and you get disruption if we put barriers along that border. It's not very compatible with the ecosystems of the Sonoran Desert, for example. So the idea of bioregionalism is that economic systems should match these biological regions. Then another alternative form of economic system would be indigenous economies. And there's a lot of push these days to revive aspects of indigenous economies that have been pushed to the side by the powerful parts of society for a while. So, we talked in our last lesson about colonialism, and colonial governments actively undermined indigenous economies in order to force indigenous people and their lands into the capitalist system. So they actively undermined the resource base of indigenous ways of life. So as an example, if you think about the bison in the American West. So we often think of that as a case of overhunting, that people were just too greedy for bison and they just went out and shot them all, and oops, now there's none left to have baby bison, and we've nearly driven the species to extinction. And it was just kind of a mistake, or a problem of people not conserving the resource, and that they would have been better off if they had reined in the hunting a little bit and made it a sustainable yield. But in fact, a lot of the slaughter of bison happened as a deliberate attempt to destroy the economic base of the tribes that depended on the bison as one of their major sources of food and clothing, etc. So bison would be slaughtered and sometimes just left to rot on the plains, just to deprive native people of that resource in order to force them onto reservations, to force them into taking up European-style farming, and so forth. So they're very deliberate and often very brutal efforts to force indigenous people into this capitalist economic system that colonialism brought with it. Now, working within the capitalist system, some indigenous nations have created successful businesses and brought in lots of money to support their people, individually, as well as to use on a national or tribal level for cultural revitalization and so forth. And so, there's obviously casinos are one of the best known examples of successful capitalist enterprises run by Native Americans. There's a bunch of different sorts of businesses that have been successful. But on the other hand, overall, if you kind of take the average for indigenous people in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, you find that they remain among the poorest, if not the poorest, racial or ethnic group in these countries. So while there are some success stories, there are also a lot of cases in which indigenous communities continue to really struggle with meeting their needs within the existing system. And there's also a long history of indigenous people using protest, using legal strategies around the treaty rights that they have on the basis of the treaties they've signed with the government in order to try to maintain some of their non-capitalist economic practices. So forms of hunting and gathering, for example, that they have rights to do under the treaties that they've signed that have been disrespected by the non-indigenous population. There have been many cases in which indigenous people have fought to maintain those things and not have them get totally sucked into a capitalist sort of system. So that means that there are many indigenous people, not everyone, there's a variety of different perspectives, but there's a significant number of indigenous people that argue that getting away from the capitalist system is essential for their culture and for their own survival and prosperity. And so a very blunt statement of that comes from Glenn Coulthard from the Yellowknives Dene, which is in in Canada, and he said, "For our nations to live, capitalism must die." And he wrote an article under that title that made the case that capitalist system is incompatible with the maintenance of the identity and culture of indigenous people. So within this idea of indigenous economies, then you have new systems being created that are based on principles that come from these pre-colonial indigenous economic systems. And it's important to remember that these pre-colonial economies were extremely diverse. There's not one indigenous economic system that would have been used, throughout what's now the United States, much less into what's now Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all these other areas that have been colonized. There's lots of different sorts of systems. And it's also important to keep in mind that these proposals for contemporary indigenous economies are not simply about trying to turn the clock back 500 years and trying to go back to exactly what people's ancestors would have been doing before Columbus showed up. It's drawing on principles from that, drawing on elements of culture that have been maintained from that earlier period of time, but it's not simply reviving exactly what would have been done in the past. So at the center of a lot of thinking about indigenous economies is the idea of returning land to indigenous control, because the relationship of people with their land is very central to most indigenous economics. And so if you don't have control over the land, then it's hard to build this alternative economic system. And so I give a couple examples there of ways this is manifested. So one is the hashtag #landback, which you'll see if you follow indigenous activists on Twitter and so forth, where they're emphasizing the idea that the central piece to reviving indigenous culture and protecting indigenous rights is returning land to control of indigenous people. And then the other example that I mentioned there is the idea of cultural fire. So this is something that's gotten a lot of attention in the wake of the major fires that happened in Australia at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and then the huge 2020 fire season in California. A lot of people have been paying a lot more attention to indigenous fire practices, and there's been a lot more movement towards making it easier for indigenous people to put their traditional fire practices back into practice and to burn the land the way that indigenous culture says it ought to be burned, as a way of avoiding these gigantic catastrophic kind of fires that have occurred on lands that have been under the control of non-indigenous people. There's a sense that non-indigenous fire management has clearly failed, so maybe the people that successfully lived in this land for thousands and thousands of years before that, maybe they know something, and maybe they should be given control over land and the ability to practice their fire practices without all of the bureaucracy and red tape that sometimes they get subject to by the Forest Service and other non-indigenous agencies. Another point to keep in mind when thinking about indigenous economies is to not assume that what indigenous people would do is the same as what non-indigenous environmentalists would want to do. So there is a kind of an alliance often between indigenous people and non-indigenous environmentalists, because there's a lot of shared ground in what these groups want, but it doesn't mean there's a completely seeing eye to eye. The indigenous people often want to make use of resources in ways that non-indigenous environmentalists may be uncomfortable with, and to modify the landscape, to not keep it as an untouched wilderness, to exploit resources in certain ways that are beneficial to indigenous communities. So you don't want to assume that environmentalism and indigenous control are necessarily the same thing, even though they often do have a lot of overlap or kind of harmony. At the center of a lot of indigenous economies is the idea that the economy is a system of interaction among human and non-human beings. So a lot of these other economic systems that we've been talking about, and certainly in capitalism, and also generally in planned economies and even in some of these localist sorts of systems, the natural environment is seen as this external thing, right? The economy is a human thing that people do, and we make use of natural resources, but they're something kind of outside of the economy. Whereas from an indigenous way of thinking, the economy is part of a system in which both humans and non-humans are all involved, and humans are just one of many communities that are interacting. And some of these other species may be referred to as nations. Right? So you have the beaver nation and the maple nation and so forth that are interacting with the human nation within this system, and we're not necessarily special here. And so within this framework, there's often an expectation that these non-humans will, in one way or another, give consent to being used, or withhold consent, in which case they shouldn't be used. And so, a tree should be asked for permission before it's cut down to be used. An animal should be asked for permission before it's hunted or caught while fishing or something. And then if that consent is obtained from these non-humans to make use of them for human purposes, to harvest them or whatever, then they need to be thanked in some way. That can involve verbal sorts of thanks. It can also involve giving some sort of gifts in compensation. And that's a very common practice among a lot of indigenous people, to leave gifts for various other non-human components of nature as part of this reciprocal exchange, right? So it's not just about extracting resources in a wise or unwise way from the land, but it's about having this reciprocal relationship where the non-humans support us and we support the non-humans in our world. Indigenous economics, and this is a kind of a connection with some of the ideas of anarchism that I was talking about in a previous slide, very often use consensus-based decision making. So rather than people just being able to do their own thing, as they might do in a capitalist system, or having a central authority making decisions, you have consensus within the community about what should be done. There's often an emphasis on subsistence rather than accumulation. So whereas in a capitalist system, the goal is to keep making more and more profit, right? You make some more profit, you reinvest it, you make even more profit, and you accumulate wealth that way. In indigenous economies, there's often an emphasis on meeting a subsistence level, and that's all the farther that you need to go. That's all the more that you really need in your economy, and so you're not trying to get as much stuff as possible. And a final note that another feature that a lot of indigenous economies will have is that they're gift-based economies. So the focus is on what you can give to others rather than what you can get through your economic decision making. And one of the classic examples of that, let me move myself out of the way a little bit there. Okay. Classic example of that is the potlatch system that was common among indigenous nations along the northwest coast of North America. And so a potlatch is kind of a social event where rich people basically compete to give away as much stuff as you can. So what makes you a prominent and important person is the amount of stuff that you can give away to other people, rather than the amount of stuff that you can accumulate for yourself. And so it's a kind of an opposite way of thinking from what we may be used to within a capitalist kind of framework. Okay, so getting to our last topic here is the question of change. So if we were to decide we want to change to one of these kinds of non-capitalist economic systems, how do we get there? And so economies change on their own. They evolve over time in various ways, but sometimes we want to deliberately seek out a particular new type of economy, right? We might want to control that change and direct it in a certain way. So one way we could do that is to have some sort of a revolution. So a rapid wholesale replacement of one system by another, right? Burn it all down and build something new from the ground up. And so this, the appeal of this, of course, is that first it can be very quick, right? Once your revolution happens, you make this total change. It also means that you're not trying to adjust your elements of your new system that you're trying to roll out and make them work with the pieces of the old system that are still in place. You don't have to worry about the old system undermining the new system. You should just, ripping it all down and starting over from scratch. But then this raises some questions, such as, can you really replace everything? Is it possible to fully burn down the old system? Fully remove everything that was part of the old system in order to build your new system there? Is there, infrastructure that's going to have to be maintained that was built based on the old system? Are there attitudes and skills that people have that from the old system that they're going to bring into the new system? All of these kinds of questions have to be asked. And then, of course, you also have to ask, do you trust the people running this revolution? Because it's not uncommon in history for a revolution that had very admirable goals and that started out with people that really wanted to make a positive change getting kind of hijacked by a group of people that had ulterior motives and distorted the implementation of that revolution into something that was very different from what the people that carried out the revolution initially were expecting to have happen. So if revolution doesn't work or has some problems, what about building an alternative system sort of on its own and hoping that it's going to grow up to replace the existing system? You can kind of try to separate yourself off from the existing system that you have problems with and just build this self-sufficient alternative and hope that people will be drawn to your alternative and let the old system kind of wither away. This also has potential problems. So the first one is, can your alternative survive long enough to propagate and grow? Because it's very hard to totally separate yourself from the existing system. The existing system is going to kind of influence you, get its claws into you, sometimes deliberately come and try to wipe you out if you're seen as a threat. But even if not, it's hard to totally separate yourself from the existing system. And so it can end up undermining these alternatives that you're trying to build. And then there's also the question of, can the alternative scale up? Something that might work for a very small group of people going off on their own to do their own thing might not be as workable to try to just grow that so that everybody's doing it throughout the entire society. So there's no one path to change that is always going to work for all situations. It's a complicated question that I can't answer in one lecture here, but hopefully that gives you some stuff to think about as we close out this last lecture.